These are the 4 categories of the beta-lactam antibiotics, and in this video I will be focusing on the evolution of the penicillins as well as touching on the beta-lactamase inhibitors. There are 2 parts to this video. The first part is introductory, where I will go over the basics including beta-lactam, mechanisms of action, and penicillin binding proteins. I will be using these 4 organisms, so that's Staph aureus, Strep pneumoniae, E. coli, and Pseudomonas, to describe the activities of the different penicillin groups. So I'll briefly go over their key features, mechanisms of antibiotic resistance, and gram-positive versus gram-negative cell walls. And then in the second part is when I will go over the 4 generations of penicillins, plus the first generation of beta-lactamase inhibitors. And all these chapters will be timestamped in the description below, so feel free to skip ahead if you want to. So let's get started with the mechanism of action of the beta-lactams. The beta-lactam ring interacts with bacterial cell wall enzymes named Penicillin Binding Proteins. PBPs are enzymes which are required by bacteria to build their cell walls. Beta-lactams bind to PBPs, in doing so deactivating them, which in turn means the bacteria cannot make their cell walls, which results in their death. PBPs are bacterial enzymes and distinctly different from human enzymes. And because the beta-lactams are specific for PBPs, for the most part, they have very few side effects unless you happen to have a true penicillin allergy. This and the fact that they are very effective against sensitive organisms makes penicillins often first line over other types of antibiotics. The origin compound of each of the 4 groups of beta-lactams were all discovered from different natural sources. The first and most famous beta-lactam, penicillin, was discovered by chance by a microbiologist called Alexander Fleming, who at the time had been growing Staphylococcus aureus on various petri dishes. Staphylococcus aureus, also known as Staph aureus, is a skin commensal routinely found residing on human skin along with other normal skin commensals. It is the main organism associated with skin and soft tissue infections. So Fleming had left out several petri dishes growing Staph aureus in the corner of his lab, and then went on holiday, and on returning he saw that one of the dishes had gotten contaminated with mold, and that the mold had managed to kill off the Staphylococcus aureus in the dish. This happened in 1928, but it took over a decade before it was finally purified and mass-produced because of World War II, where the UK government needed to find a medicine to help the soldiers who were dying from infections, and this happened in 1943. And this revolutionary moment became the beginning of the age of antibiotics. However, pretty much straight away, it was noticed that overuse of penicillin produced resistant strains of Staphylococcus aureus. And before long, the overuse of penicillin caused more and more strains of Staph aureus to naturally become resistant to penicillins. And nowadays, penicillin is virtually useless against Staph aureus and is never used empirically to treat any suspected Staph aureus infections, which is quite something considering the role Staph aureus had in the discovery of penicillin in the first place. And the same thing happened with Neisseria gonorrhea, but here penicillin still retained activity and was the standard treatment for gonorrhea right up until the 80s. But then after, due to resistance, penicillin couldn't be used first line anymore, which was a devastating blow to the medical community. The emergence of penicillin-resistant Staph aureus sparked off a kind of war between scientists and bacteria and the golden era of antibiotic discovery. For the beta-lactams, the natural origin compounds were taken and then modified to produce a range of different variants or derivatives with differing antimicrobial and pharmacokinetic profiles. However, ultimately, scientists realized as soon as a new antibiotic gets widely prescribed, in only a matter of a couple of years, strains of bacteria resistant to said antibiotic would be discovered, which then led to a slowdown in new antibiotics being produced from the 1970s onwards. So most of the antibiotics commonly used today pretty much all emerged during this golden age era. Just as a reminder, we do live in a world owned by microorganisms, and our own immune systems are also highly dependent on a symbiotic relationship we have with bacteria, so antibiotics should be used judiciously and only when required. And also, where possible, a narrow-spectrum antibiotic is preferred to a broad-spectrum antibiotic. There are four main mechanisms by which bacteria can resist antibiotics: bacterial enzymes, which hydrolyze antibiotics; mutation of the antibiotic target; efflux pumps, which can eject antibiotics out of the bacteria; and reduced cell wall permeability. Beta-lactamases are a large family of bacterial enzymes which are able to hydrolyze beta-lactams. I will touch on target mutation, which is the modus operandi for MRSA, where the Penicillin Binding Protein (PBP) has mutated. Pseudomonas, as well as having beta-lactamases, also has reduced cell wall permeability and efflux pumps. To try and keep this video simple, I will mostly be using these four organisms to illustrate antibiotic activity. These are not the only organisms these antibiotics can cover, but these four are enough to illustrate the main differences between the different types of penicillin antibiotics. Staph aureus and Strep pneumoniae are key gram-positive organisms, and E. coli is a key representative for the gram-negatives. Pseudomonas aeruginosa is also a gram-negative and is an important multi-drug resistant organism. The gram-negative cell walls have both an outer membrane and an inner membrane, and sandwiched in the middle is a thin peptidoglycan layer. Gram-positives only have an inner membrane and a peptidoglycan layer, and do not have an outer membrane, but their peptidoglycan layer is much thicker than that for gram-negatives. The outer membrane for gram-negatives serve as a tough protective barrier to enable them to survive harsh external environments. A majority of enteric bacteria, including E. coli, are gram-negatives with outer membranes. Pseudomonas aeruginosa is an extremely hardy gram-negative which is able to survive ubiquitously out in nature and is known to have a particularly tough outer membrane. Generally speaking, it is more difficult for antibiotics to penetrate gram-negatives and to get past the outer membrane. The antibiotic needs to find a passageway through, and most of the traditional antibiotics have done so via the porin channels, which are in the outer membranes. These porins serve as pores to enable the passage of small hydrophilic molecules such as sugars, amino acids, and water into the membrane. So it's possible for antibiotics to traverse porins if they too are small and hydrophilic, such as amoxicillin. Staph aureus, I have already mentioned before, is a skin commensal associated with skin infections. Staph aureus' signature mechanism of resistance is production of a type of beta-lactamase called penicillinase, which can deactivate all of the penicillins, and a lot of antibiotics are defined by whether they have activity against Staph aureus or not. And then its notorious offspring, methicillin-resistant Staph aureus, MRSA, which has an alternative mechanism whereby their actual PBPs have mutated and beta-lactams literally cannot bind to them. MRSA has gone on to become notorious for its ability to resist almost all the beta-lactams. Streptococcus pneumoniae, also known as strep pneumoniae or pneumococcus, is the most important causative agent for community-acquired pneumonia and meningitis in young children and the elderly. It naturally resides in the nasal carriages of healthy carriers, where it can be transmitted via respiratory droplets. It's one of the few and most important organisms still susceptible to penicillin, which remains the first-line antibiotic to treat strep pneumoniae. And there are pneumococcal vaccines available, which are recommended for young children and the elderly. Escherichia coli, commonly known as E. coli, is a commensal gut bacteria where it only becomes pathogenic if displaced and is a common cause of food poisoning, urinary tract infections, and intra-abdominal infections, where in serious cases it can get into the bloodstream and cause sepsis. E. coli has some basic antibiotic resistance against penicillin via its gram-negative cell wall, but in addition, Due to antibiotic selection, it can also produce an array of beta-lactamases. Pseudomonas, unlike the other bacteria so far covered, does not require a human body to survive. Pseudomonas is naturally very robust and tough, which enables it to live in places like the soil and in natural water sources. Because it can colonize in water, it is occasionally associated with Pseudomonal folliculitis, but otherwise it does not really cause any issues in patients with normal immune systems. It is naturally also able to colonize on artificial man-made environments, including surfaces such as table surfaces and even hospital equipment. Pseudomonas can colonize on skin, but this is not commonly seen except in hospitalized patients, where Pseudomonas then becomes associated with surgical site infections and problematic in burns patients. It has almost all the mechanisms of antibiotic resistance, and for its outer wall membrane, Pseudomonas porins are different from E. coli porins in that they are more specific in the type of molecules they will allow to pass through. This makes Pseudomonas cell walls more difficult to penetrate than E. coli and other gram-negatives, and is one of the factors behind Pseudomonas' multi-drug resistance capability. Fortunately, it normally does not affect healthy patients, but it does become problematic in immunocompromised patients and hospitalized patients, where it can cause various different types of infections, including UTI, pneumonia, and sepsis. The penicillins and other beta-lactams evolved to try and address the issues of emerging resistance and also to try and target other types of bacteria, including multi-drug resistant organisms. There are 4 groups or generations of penicillins: the natural penicillins, which consist of the original penicillin compound, the anti-staphylococcal penicillins, the aminopenicillins, and the anti-Pseudomonal penicillins. The natural penicillins came out in the 40s, and the rest mostly came out in the 60s, with amoxicillin and piperacillin coming out in the 70s. The penicillin's beta-lactam nucleus consists of the 4-member beta-lactam ring fused to a 5-member sulfur ring, where the sulfur is in the 1 position of the 4-5 ring. So all the penicillins have this core 4-5 ring nucleus, and they vary according to the side chain they have, which is situated at the 6th position. There are 2 penicillins in the natural penicillins group. We've got penicillin G and penicillin V, which are both chemically very similar and relatively simple as well. So penicillin is quite narrow spectrum. It did lose its activity against Staph aureus and Neisseria gonorrhea, as mentioned. Its narrow spectrum and low toxicity makes it the first-line antibiotic for the organisms it can still kill. For my chart, I have chosen only Strep pneumoniae to illustrate the activity of the natural penicillins, but it is also the main antibiotic used for Treponema pallidum, which causes syphilis. Pen G is IV only, and Pen V is the PO or oral variant. So Pen G is more potent and is what you tend to see being used for the treatment of syphilis, and is a key antibiotic for confirmed Strep pneumoniae, but generally it is too narrow spectrum to be used empirically, so normally would need lab tests to confirm Streptococcus pneumoniae before it is then deployed. Pen V can be used for confirmed and uncomplicated streptococcal infections, such as strep throat caused by Streptococcus pyogenes, also known as group A strep. So the terms narrow spectrum and broad spectrum are relative terms. I will refer to penicillin as being narrow spectrum based on the number of organisms it can cover compared to, for example, meropenem. The next generation of penicillin antibiotics are the anti-staphylococcal penicillins and the aminopenicillins, which came out around the same period of time in the 1960s. The anti-staph penicillins all have bulkier side chains which block the penicillinase beta-lactamases, restoring their activity against Staph aureus. The PO antistaphers also have halogenic compounds incorporated, such as chlorine and fluorine. In the UK, they use flucloxacillin. In the US, they use dicloxacillin. One has 2 chlorines and the other one has 1 chlorine and 1 fluorine. Interestingly, they don't have activity against almost any other organism, including pneumococcus, making them very narrow spectrum indeed. The narrow spectrum of the anti-Staph penicillins makes them useful for confirmed Staph aureus skin infections, and this is usually where you will see them being used. The first anti-Staph penicillin was methicillin, from which the name of MRSA comes from, but methicillin itself has been discontinued due to side effects. Whilst the anti-staphers all have activity against Staph aureus, they do not have activity against MRSA. I wanted to touch on the first generation beta-lactamase inhibitors before going on, and these came out after the golden era started dying down, and scientists were looking for alternative strategies to tackle antibiotic resistance. Clavulanic acid was the first one and came out in 1974. Sulbactam came out a decade later, and the latest one, tazobactam, came out a decade after that. Their beta-lactam nucleus is similar to that of the penicillins, with variations at the 1 position and with little side chains at the 2 positions. These compounds came out along with the other beta-lactam compounds during the discovery stage, and it was found that whilst they themselves did not have much antibacterial activity, they were able to bind to beta-lactamases and disable them. You can see that beta-lactamase inhibitor compounds are quite simple. The most well-known is clavulanic acid, being part of the Amox-Clav duo. Which beta-lactam inhibitor is chosen to pair up with a particular antibiotic is according to their half-lives. So compounds with similar half-lives are paired together for dosing convenience. These were the main beta-lactamase inhibitors for a while. The second generation beta-lactamase inhibitors are much more recent, with avibactam coming out in the 2010s. They are not beta-lactams, so I won't talk about them that much here. They do have more enhanced beta-lactamase inhibiting capabilities than the first gens, but for now they are reserved for more difficult to treat multi-drug resistant bacteria. The aminopenicillins consist of ampicillin and amoxicillin. Ampicillin came first, where it is basically just penicillin with an additional amino group on the side chain. This amino group does not block beta-lactamases, so does not restore activity against Staph aureus, but it does give the compound a hydrophilic charge, which enables it to traverse the porins of gram-negative bacteria. So this now enabled doctors to treat E. coli as well as other important gram-negative infections. That is until resistance set in. Amoxicillin came next, and it is basically ampicillin with an additional hydroxyl group on the end aromatic group. It has a similar spectrum of activity to ampicillin, except it has a better pharmacokinetic profile and better bioavailability. And nowadays has pretty much superseded ampicillin. Whilst ampicillin and amoxicillin could once have been described as broad spectrum, as they were able to get into gram-negatives the way that the original penicillins couldn't, however, on their own, they're not able to resist degradation by the beta-lactamases, which gram-negatives are now able to produce prolifically. So in practice, a lot of their gram-negative activity is quite minimal, making its spectrum almost similar to penicillin nowadays. Amoxicillin on its own can be used as an alternative to penicillin. Amoxicillin PO does have a better pharmacokinetic profile than PO penicillin does. However, it is mostly seen in combination with beta-lactamase inhibitor, where it really starts to shine. The beta-lactamase inhibitor restores all of amoxic's activity against all the gram-negatives it is able to access, and Amoxicillin-Clavulanic acid is the main antibiotic used for E. coli infections. The beta-lactamase inhibitor also restores its activity against Staph aureus, and Amox-Clav is also used a lot for Staph aureus coverage. Amox-Clav also has some activity against anaerobes, so you will also see it being used to provide some anaerobic coverage. So that's why you will see it being used a lot, as it can be used for a number of different indications, including UTIs, wound infections, and it is also first line for community-acquired pneumonia over penicillin, until lab results come back to confirm what the causative organism is, and then maybe it can then be switched to a more narrow spectrum antibiotic. So Amoxicillin can be truly described as a broad-spectrum antibiotic and is probably the most prescribed antibiotic combination in the world. Probably too overprescribed given that it is quite broad-spectrum, which is also to do with the fact that it can be taken PO as a tablet or a syrup form, but it is safe and very effective for the organisms that it can cover. It does not have any activity against MRSA or Pseudomonas. So that leads us to the last group in the penicillins family, which is the Anti-Pseudomonal Penicillins. Ticarcillin came out first in 1963, and then piperacillin came out a decade later in 1974. And piperacillin is actually the last penicillin to have emerged, for now anyway. The two do have quite different side chains, and I couldn't find any information on specifically how they give them anti-pseudomonal activity, but it would seem they somehow enable them to be accepted by Pseudomonas porins. Piperacillin is more effective than ticarcillin for Pseudomonas, so I will mostly be referring to piperacillin in this video. Piperacillin is derived from ampicillin with an additional side chain extension at the amino group. There is a urido group connected to a piperazine molecule. Piperazine itself is traditionally an anthelmintic drug used to treat worms, but I don't know if there's any connection between this and piperacillin's anti-pseudomonal activity, but this is clearly where the name piperacillin comes from. The anti-pseudomonal penicillins are IV only as they are deactivated by stomach acids, so are hospital-only drugs. The side chain for piperacillin enables piperacillin to traverse the Pseudomonas porins and in addition seems to enable it to bond more effectively with PBPs. However, this side chain, even though it is bulky, does not stop it from being hydrolyzed by beta-lactamases. And on its own, it doesn't have any activity against Staph aureus. They are normally given in combination with a beta-lactamase inhibitor. In the case of piperacillin, it's tazobactam, and for ticarcillin, it is clavulanic acid. Again, pip-taz is more effective than clavulanic acid, so I'm just going to focus on pip-taz. The spectrum of pip-taz is similar to amoxicillin, with the key difference being the additional anti-pseudomonal activity. I would classify pip-taz as being very broad spectrum, which is also known as a big gun antibiotic, but the main indication for pip-taz is being the first-line antibiotic for Pseudomonas. So, although pip-taz is a big gun antibiotic combination, neither it nor any of the other penicillins have activity against MRSA, and the first-generation beta-lactamase inhibitors only have partial activity against ESBL, which is extended-spectrum beta-lactamase, and this will be a topic for another video. And that's it for this video overview of the penicillins family. Hope you found it interesting and stay tuned for more videos on other beta-lactam antibiotics. This video is not medical advice. Always consult a medical practitioner for tailored medical advice. Thank you for watching.